Sort of at the beginning of my career, I was focused on English speakers' acquisition of mood in Spanish. And so I say the term mood selection because this is not an issue of simply learning to use the subjunctive. Those things get sort of conflated in a lot of L2 research. Rather, what I was focused on was the fact that in nominal and in adjectival clauses, or what you might call restrictive clauses, students must always consider whether they must use the indicative or the subjunctive, whether one of those two is necessary. So that's why I refer to as mood selection. They do have to know the subjunctive, but they're constantly having to select between the indicative and the subjunctive. So for instance, in clauses such as quiero que me ayudes con un problema, there ayudes was needed because the subjunctive was needed, versus something like sabemos que ayudas a muchas personas, where there the indicative was needed. Or, for instance, in adjectival, or what you guys might call restrictive clauses, based on whether the antecedent is variable or something like that, you would use either indicative or the subjunctive. Busco un compañero que no sea puerco, versus tenemos un coche que va bien rápido, for example. So the idea is you're constantly selecting between the indicative and the subjunctive. So some of the reasons that what are some of the reasons that learners struggle with mood? And here's some of the things that we learned. That as learners progress in their development, they prefer what are called paratactic and coordinate strategies over subordination, for example. So meaning the complex syntax really doesn't develop until very late in learners' development. And when they do produce complex syntax, they tend to struggle to sort of transfer information between clauses. And that's a key issue. So just to make sure people understand what I'm talking about here is a learner may prefer to say, or is only able to, depending on your perspective, to produce something such as busco un compañero y no puede ser puerco, instead of busco un compañero que no sea puerco, for example. Or they may simply juxtapose two sentences saying, vienes a mi fiesta, me gusta eso, instead of saying, me gusta que vengas a mi fiesta, which is what what a lot of textbooks for learners sort of implies are the preferred ways of producing. But learners sort of get around that by producing sort of the same ideas, but with a lot less complex syntax. And so that indicates that to us that subordination comes very, very late in learners' development. And then finally, one must consider the subjunctive morphology itself, that it's derived from other inflections, meaning that subjunctive morphology is sort of a hybrid between derivational and inflectional morphological processes. If you think about it, just that conjugation in and of itself, tengamos, derives from another conjugated verb or inflected verb, tengo, which in turn derives from the infinitive tener, or whatever model you want to use. So from there, I began to look at complexity with corpus tools. I had always been interested in technology myself because I've been researching CALL from way back when. That's another life that I have on the side, looking at computer-assisted language learning. And then I've been a computer programmer for decades. And so since getting into this business, I've gone through numerous iterations and development of a Spanish L2 tagger. It's nothing that's in the public domain. But it is something that's taken years to develop, because developing a tagger to anticipate what second language learners do is really quite a task. And there's a lot of I would say extra steps involved, especially at the level of sort of hard coding lexical patterns that you see amongst learners. At the same time, I sort of watch the development of and utilize tools such as Python, Natural Language Toolkit, and R statistical packages as well. And I've been largely focused on designing experiments where learners participate in a task, and then we gather textual data from instant messaging technologies. And so I'll show that to you, what I mean by that in a minute. So I'm going to share a couple of studies that Karina Collentine and I have conducted with you guys today. Hopefully I can get there's time to get to the second study. Both are going to appear in separate volumes, appearing this summer from John Benjamin's. In the first study, okay, we take issue with how much of TBLT research, or task-based language teaching research, operationalizes the notion of linguistic complexity. You sort of remember that they use this notion of CAF, which is complexity, accuracy, and fluency. Sort of we took the notion that 𝗏𝗏 and Ortega developed a nice paper in applied linguistics in 2009, where they argued that this line of research uses a very limited number of metrics, and that there's an assumption that the assessment of linguistic complexity can be accomplished with a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach. And so here we're talking about the use of T units, MLUs, and simple lexical metrics such as type token ratios. Now I want to emphasize that there's nothing wrong with any one of these measures in and of themselves, but the concern is that TBLT research tends to focus on one or two of these measures in any given study as sort of a macro measure of complexity. I realize that this is, taking very much a reductionist approach, but I never apologize for that whatsoever. So additionally, the assumption is that in TBLT research, and this is my concern with it, and also 𝗏𝗏 and Ortega's, is that the longer your phrases are, the higher linguistic complexity is. And we know a lot more about linguistic complexity than to use that as the single or the favorite, let me say, way of measuring linguistic complexity. So what we've learned is that linguistic complexity is a function of cognitive complexity, structural elaboration, and functional abstractness. So you can see just from the very beginning there that to simply say I'm going to measure complexity with mean length of utterance or type token ratios or T units probably won't do a good job of covering what we really know linguistic complexity entails, what we've learned in the last 20 or 30 years. Cognitive complexity even occurs in native speaker speech, meaning that as native speakers increase subordination and inflectional abstractness, I should say, their processing times of those sentences actually increases superlinearly, meaning that the more complexity an utterance has for a native speaker, their processing time doesn't increase linearly. It increases superlinearly, meaning almost exponentially, although that's an exaggeration. But superlinearly is sort of a between linearly and exponentially. So I don't want to exaggerate too much there, but that's an important point. It also implies that the more elaborate your phrase structure, the more processing resources you're going to need. And it also, the further your verbal morphology is from the here and now, the more processing resources you'll need to present your ideas. So the idea is that our perspective is that this has to have an effect on language learners as well. These issues should be considered in our definitions of complexity. So what we did was we conducted a factor analysis of the syntactic features that the morphosyntactic features, I'm sorry, that the 3 levels of learners utilize in the task to see how those features were grouping together at the different levels. And we also used a native speaker baseline as a point of reference rather than using a normative-based perspective on what complexity was. So meaning we wanted to see, how morphosyntactic complexity was playing itself out under similar conditions for native speakers, and then how that was playing out amongst 3 levels of learners. And so we had learners at the end of the first, second, and third years of instructions, and then we sampled the corpus del español to derive a native speaker baseline. So what the learners did was, actually I'll jump over that one, is what the learners did was they first explored a 3D world that we designed, and their task was to identify who the thief of a particular item was. And then after that, they got into chat rooms, and they were to sort of compare notes and come to consensus in pairs of 2 on who done it, basically. Okay. And then what we did was we stored that data from the chat rooms, and then we analyzed it for a number of factors. And as you can see here on the right side there, that's a typical sort of interaction between 2 students. Where they got to the chat room and they tried to solve the whodunit mystery. Okay, so we analyzed the data for both part of speech and for syntactic tree objects. And this last part was new for me since it involved the development of a regular expressions parser. So meaning that the data we got from those learners, we did a basic part of speech analysis of every single one of the words. And then we used what was called a regular expressions parser to analyze the syntactic units that were there, rather than sort of measuring those syntactic units with brute force, to tell the truth. And we were pretty pleased with the results we got. So for the study, what we did was we gave weights to different syntactic frames a priori based on their potential for depth of embedding. So, for instance, for any given structure a student produced, she was given a higher score for any relative clause that she produced than she would have received for any noun phrase clause that she would have produced. And any given word, just anticipate questions, might have been analyzed twice, because if you had a word inside of a noun clause, they were given points for that, let's put it that way. But then if that noun clause was inside an adverbial clause, they were also given points for that. So we realized, some sort of the potential conflation that can happen with that. And that's why we were dead set on finding out how these numbers were playing themselves out within a native speaker baseline. We also weighted the production of inflectional morphology. It was mostly with verbs, and we based this on an analysis of markedness theory, and also on Reichenbach's scheme, which basically says the further away an inflection's notion is from the here and now, the more abstract that it is. So future would be more abstract than the present tense, for instance. All right. So these here is just a bunch of data. We can come back to that if you want, which I doubt you will. But basically, we use the scoring. We use that scoring scheme. I'm sorry, to see how the baseline native speakers were grouping complexity measures together and comparing those groupings to all 3 of the levels of learners. And sort of, just to give you an idea, maybe you can look at this 3rd year group over here, sort of bringing this down to earth a little bit. And this was a finding. This was the syntactic factor analysis for the learners at the third year, where we found sort of 4 factors there, four groupings of these syntactic frames, and bring that even down further to earth here. One factor then involved the use of numerous nominal phrases and prepositional phrases. So, so for instance, a student here under primary, produced something along the line of el tesoro estaba cerca de, prepositional phrase, and then 𝗵𝗏𝗋, for example. Okay. Another strategy that they used was, it looks like that they were involved in using modification, where nouns were modified with adjectives, and also we sort of threw into that group the use of pronouns that were modifying verbs as well. And that's sort of a Spanish thing. And then another thing was the use of stance, where they would sort of qualify ideas with main clause verbs, like puedo contarte lo que ellos habían dicho. So at any rate, so we decided to focus on syntax and morphology separately. And the top of this graphic here, or this slide here, shows the type of structures that work together on the 5 dimensions found in the native speaker sample. And you can see that subordination appears in almost all dimensions of the native speakers, and that any one dimension uses a diverse set of those subordinate structures. But for the learners, simple structures dominated in the most important factors at both the first and the second years. Okay, and the subordination is sort of utilized, but is underutilized when you compare it to the native speaker models. And really, it remains a secondary strategy from the first well into the third year. In the third year, students are supposed to be ready to jump into their major classes, let's put it that way. So anyway, there's just another chart there. We can come back to that if you want. But so basically, in short, what we found was, syntactically speaking, most complexity occurs in nominal phrases for first and second year learners, meaning complexity consists of modifying the nuclei of noun phrases and verb phrases rather than the production of subordinate clauses. So this suggests to us, or suggested to us, that we should be analyzing the complexity of noun phrases and verb phrases at the beginning stages of acquisition to see, whether complexity is taking place, rather than focusing on subordination, because subordination at these levels is really a secondary complexity strategy. Okay. Interestingly, what we found was that relativization, or the use of adjectival clauses, seems to be one of the very last things that learners acquire, and it's one of the most difficult to produce. We did the same sort of analysis. Let me jump ahead here. We did the same sort of analysis for morphology, and we produced separate factor analyses for the native speaker baseline and for the 3 levels of instruction. We found that the native speakers used mostly the past tense, but that they used a diverse set of verbal inflections. Okay, and the factor analysis indicated the native speakers had distinct roles for present tense, past tense, and irrealities, meaning that they were sort of, those different verbal inflections were grouping separately rather than together. But for the learners, we found that they were using a very limited set of verbal inflections, and for the most part, they were using the past and the present tense, at least in this particular task. Okay. We saw indications that different verb tenses were starting to take on distinct functions as learners increased in proficiency. But from our point of view, the most important point here is that at the earliest stages of development, morphological complexity really was associated with the use of various different tenses at the same time. So what we're saying there is that where you see sort of an anarchic use of a lot of different tenses at the earliest stages of acquisition, this may be an indication of inflectional and/or conceptual complexity on the part of the learner. And in other research, in other TBLT research, for instance, that would be counted against students as being inaccurate, for instance. So anyway, that was our take on it. I will quickly then go over review what we saw in the second study. I'll do this a little more conciseness. Okay, and what we wanted to do there was take sort of the same perspective and look at some heritage language learners. And so in the United States, heritage language learners are, for the most part, people who learn Spanish as a first language, and then they learned English second, either simultaneously or for the most part sequentially, meaning that they started to give English a more and more important role. Okay, and the research on heritage language learners is interesting because it's becoming a very large industry in the United States. But one of the concerns that my colleagues and I have with it is that while they're developing methodological materials for those classes, it's becoming economically more and more important, that the methodological materials that are being developed basically ignores everything we've learned in second language acquisition research over the last 20 to 30 years, specifically as regards the role of cognition. So most heritage language learning research assumes that heritage language learners have largely in place all the syntactic abilities that they will ever have, meaning that they're not going to grow anymore, okay? And it also assumes that any sort of perceived deficiencies are due to holes in their knowledge of the language that they learned first, meaning they learned holes in their knowledge of Spanish. So the research ignores the possibility that shortcomings in their productions could be due to cognitive factors, such as those I was talking about in the previous study, such as processing limitation. Move on here. And what we did the same sort of studies I mentioned before, this time with chat data from heritage speakers at the second and third years of instructions. And they appeared in the same sort of experiment in the 3D world followed by SCMC. And we did have a native speaker baseline. And we used the native speaker baseline and a factor analysis to derive an empirically based model of syntactic elaboration, meaning we tabulated the amount of elaboration within various syntactic structures. We then saw, we then sought to determine where those syntactic structures were grouping together in the baseline data. And finally, we examined how much the heritage speakers were elaborating and whether they were doing so in the same way as the native speaker baseline. And just as a side note, if you guys get into research on heritage speakers, don't use the term native speaker baseline. Some readers had some major problems with it. And we have the article published, and I still couldn't, for the life of me this morning, remember what the term that we were first to use. But it was less colonialist and et cetera, et cetera. So at any rate, let's see here. What we did was we used an native speaker baseline. We came up with 3 basic elaboration strategies from the factor analysis. And then for each of the heritage speakers, we calculated the score for each of these 3 strategies. And you can do this with factor analysis by taking the items in each of the dimensions and using them as weights. We actually did it with PCA, to tell you the truth, and that comes up with a better way of calculating that. And then we used those data in the cluster analysis to see how the heritage speakers were grouping together. And I'm almost done here. Okay. What we found was that there were some learners who produced little elaboration across the board, some that produced quite a bit, and that some that were in the middle there. Okay, and so what was interesting to us was that a quarter of these learners demonstrated that they could produce that where they do produce syntactically complex structures, they elaborate very little within those structures, meaning that, so okay, you can say that these heritage speakers produce syntactic structures on par with native speakers, or with monolingual speakers. That was a term, I'm sorry, that they asked us to use. But what we found was there's a significant proportion of these students who, whereas they might produce the same syntactic features, that the amount of elaboration that they had within each of those features was much less than you would find on average with monolingual speakers who learned Spanish and went to school, and et cetera, et cetera. So at any rate, that's what we found in those two studies. And that's what we've been using our time with our Corpus tools to look at. I will stop sharing at that point.
Great. Thank you, Joe, so far. We have time for questions, answers. I think you do have a question there on the Q&A.
Let's see here. Is it in the chat or?
No, it's on the Q&A.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. I got you. Okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. All right. Let me know how to create corpus-based activity. So, Durdona, the corpus-based activity, I would, not trying to avoid the question, what we've been doing, this is just two of the studies we've done, is that we've been having basic TBLT, sort of task-based activities, and then we gather data from within those activities. What we've tried to do is keep the whole activity, though, digital, so that just to make it easier to collect the data, and also to keep the experience sort of a digital experience. So that's why we had them do it within a 3D world. But I guess you could, one thing that's been on our bucket list to do would be to have students actually interacting with each other like they do in gaming, right? While they're doing the activity. And then that's been sort of a tough nut to crack. Although probably today, if we were to sort of look at the technologies, it might be a little bit easier. But that would be the best way to do it, would be to embed interacting with each other while they're doing a task. Hola Viviana, yo te veo, yo vi tu saludo. All right. Why was NP only classified as 1 on the complexity rating? Yeah. So so they were all candidates for complexity. So getting a 1 did not imply that it was non-complex, but rather we wanted to come up with a way of weighting all of the complexity candidates, okay, be they VPs or NPs, and to the extent that NPs can be embedded within something such as a relative clause, for instance, or an adverbial clause, we gave it a lower weight in terms of complexity potential. So, what was the process you used to tag the learner corpus? You do some manual tagging. Oh, I hate manual tagging. I really do. Life is, well, it's got to be done. Life is too short for manual tagging.
Yeah.
But I have a joke with, I think I told 𝗪𝗲𝗍 this, is that all of us guys who go into technology are really lazy cruds at the end of the day. When we don't use the word crud, but I'll use crud here, okay? And that is that you know, we try to create some sort of instrument through technology, but at the end of the day, we're extremely lazy, and we want the technology to do the work for us. So, but there is some manual tagging, yes. But what I've been able to do over the years is that I have enough studies with Spanish learners in the context where I'm learning, meaning, you know, from my program with the vocabulary that they have, the sort of structure they use, that I have enough formulaic utterances that I've seen and be able to sort of, you know, I've been able to do simply look at collocations of learners within all the data sets that I have. And then we use those to hard code the data for tagging on the front end. And then every word is given sort of a tag in and of itself to say, don't try to tag me again, I've already been tagged. Does that make sense? So, so the fact that the conventional taggers may have reliability issues. Yeah, I mean, no, I wouldn't say reliability issues. What I would say is accuracy issues, and that would be different from reliability. They do a really good job in terms of, you know, depending on the sophistication of the guessing models that they use, but they're just low in accuracy from the get-go with learners. So that's how we've been able to resolve it. Yeah, I've been able to. So going on to Marilys's question, have you been able to work with improving heritage speakers syntactic complex structures through Corpus use data-driven learning? Well, no, but it would be something to look at, and that would, from my perspective, I would say that would not be the answer for heritage language learners. What our sort of point is that a lot of the instruction for heritage language learners really is like taking the instruction of grammar for maybe 8th graders in an L1 situation. So if you grew up in Bolivia, for example, or Argentina, and you took sort of 8th grade grammar classes, okay, that is how the instruction for heritage speakers is being carried out for the most part in the United States. And what we were trying to show was that, well, but maybe there are some cognitive considerations, you know, that we should start incorporating into our instruction. But I wouldn't say DDL would be the main thing. I would really rather see sort of some of those features that have come out of TBLT on how to prep learners for going in activities, you know, such as rehearsal strategies, things of that nature, and even some of the findings that we found on consciousness raising, to incorporate those into the classes. And even as crazy as it might sound, I would actually love to see some experiments on processing instruction with heritage language learners, because they don't really need to improve to work on production with the same vigor that we do with native speakers of English. You know, they can work their way around a communicative situation, but if we can elevate their consciousness about certain syntactic structures or morphological grammatical structures, that would be really helpful. Would the results have been different if you had, this is Stephen Hughes, would the results have been different if you had used proficiency framework criteria for 𝗪𝗱 instead of the North American speaker? Well, so what we were trying to do was avoid, in these two studies, the use of any norms referenced criterion, right? We wanted to say we wanted to take full use of what sort of the strategies that corpus tools have afforded us, and methodologies as well, I want to say. To say, look, let's look to see what a baseline group of people are doing. Let's analyze them, even though not with a huge study. We had like maybe 32,000 words in the native speaker data in both of the studies. But we wanted to say, here's an empirically defensible model of what native speakers are doing, or more advanced speakers are doing, or monolingual speakers are doing, and then let's compare the learners to what's going on there. So anyway, that's why, not to totally avoid your question, but we did want to avoid, I guess, any sort of norm-based analysis or premises on complexity. Let's see here. Rogerio writes, emphatic sentences like "a mí no me gusta esta actitud" generates relevant complexity for I see, relative complexity, I think you mean for Spanish learners. Absolutely it does, yes, because if you look at the argument structure of that sentence, it's extremely complex. So maybe Rogerio is agreeing with me, then it's actually quite complex to ask learners to master things such as "me gusta que tengas una actitud buena", por ejemplo. Okay, Viviana is agreeing. Accuracy is an issue in the Spanish one. I wish Viviana would clarify what she means by that.
She means in the Spanish tagger. She wrote that while you were answering.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We could get into numbers. Do you mean like 70%, or do you mean 60%? Viviana or Larissa? Okay. Marilisa, I'm sorry. In your study, I couldn't use the paratextual encoding and processing. Also couldn't it be considered a signal of natural language use, regardless of whether it was complex? Yeah, I do agree that it is. Oh, I see you're saying that even maybe native speakers might do that, and they do. However, I do want to say is that what corpus linguistic research has found over the last, I would say, 10 years, is that most subordination occurs in conversational speech. It doesn't occur in academic writing. So subordination, the use of nominal clauses and relative clauses, is actually very common in conversational speech. And when you go to college and you learn to write, you actually learn to use those structures a lot less. You learn to nominalize and things of that nature. And not a lot has been done in Spanish or in Portuguese, but my own sort of superficial examination of that is showing that it's turned out to be the case in Romance languages as well. So I think there's been sort of this, and that's where these T units came from, right? Was saying, well, the more T units in your writing, the more subordination in your writing, the more sophisticated your writing. And it turns out that that's actually not really a good indicator of how sophisticated your writing is. It's more the noun structures and the modification of those structures and prepositional phrases. Leonardo, saludos. What experimental measures have psycholinguistic studies used? Yeah, not priming, but rather they've looked at they've looked at response times, and then basically make things, in pocas palabras, what they've done is they've said, okay, let me throw in, you know, a new verb tense here, okay, you might not be expecting, you know, like switching from starting off in the present and then throwing in the past, maybe in reported speech in the second clause, or they'll throw in there an anaphoric pronoun, or any sort of anaphor there to see whether that slows them down, and it slows down even native speakers. When you think about it, it just means that native speaker speech isn't simply always reacting using your knowledge of the language, but there are processing issues that interact with. Even like right now, you know, I'm trying to answer all these questions, and you know, you can tell at the end of 50 minutes that you're tired. My students are always glad when I'm tired at the end of 50 minutes, because it means I'm going to shut up. Time for a break. Any other questions? Am I not going down far enough? Oh, there is. Viviana, she says, we've been working with Spanish Tagger and we found a lot of issues. I don't have numbers here, but it was an issue. Yeah, the numbers are really, and the problem is, Viviana, with Romance languages is that there's all that inflectional morphology that you don't have in English. You know, what is it? We counted up with my students. There are 42 conjugations for any verb in Spanish, okay? And English, maybe 4 at the maximum, 5 on a good day. So yeah, it's a really hard ask, isn't it? It really is. It's a hard ask to come up with accuracy. I see Tony's shaking his head as well. I'm sure he had the same. I had the same questions about his multidimensional analysis of Portuguese as well, because
I think that we could have a Tagger, Romance language Tagger meeting just to cry over it, because I know that Adriana is also attending this webinar, and I know that she also had to work with tagging Portuguese. So one day, guys, let's all meet and talk about taggers.
Absolutely, yes, that would be a lot. Yeah, the hard coding part of it too, and sort of, you know, a workflow, because it really requires a different workflow. It really does. Okay.
Joe, I have a question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how relative the notion of complexity is. Because it seems to me it's based on the L1 background to some extent. For instance, subjunctive is considered complex. However, if you're a speaker of Portuguese, then you might argue it's not that complex, because your L1 will have a very similar grammatical system in the case of the subjunctive. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this, how relative this construct is.
Yeah. How relative it is? Well, if it is relative, then one would have to adopt a very, if it's not as relevant, let's put it that way. So if you have two similar sister languages, then the assumption, your theoretical assumption would probably have to be that L1 transfer plays a big issue, okay? And so 2 points. One is that people looking at universal grammar would say that that's precisely the point, that what happens is when, or that these two modules, the morphosyntactic module and then the discourse pragmatic module, and in L2 acquisition, those two modules seem not to talk very well together. They don't communicate very well. And so then when that happens, in the absence of that, what happens is that L1 transfer comes in to play, okay? So if that is the assumption, and if that's sort of the reading that's strongly influencing the researcher, then that would suggest that things are going to be pretty easy for a Portuguese speaker learn Spanish, or vice versa. Okay. From a cognitive perspective, if the cognitive model is playing an important role, then I would say that one needs to focus on you'll get different results. That in second language acquisition processing, all of those intentional resources, regardless of whether your two languages are close or not, are so taxed within any short period of time that there's bound to be things that go wrong when you're trying to retrieve even structures that are similar between the two languages. Meaning, you know, so take for instance when some of my students, and they're mostly Spanish speakers, although they're heritage speakers of Spanish, they're not native speakers of Spanish in my program, but they struggle immensely with going beyond the present and the preterite and imperfect. Actually, they do a really good job of the preterite and perfect. But once I get them into oral interviews, they're having to hypothesize. Things just start going badly. You know, the tenses become very anarchic. And I saw, at least with these groups of learners, they really, over this year, they had a hard time getting past. They did great with the preterite and perfect, but beyond that, conditional things of that nature. So I think we're a long ways from knowing. I think this research on Spanish speakers learning Portuguese really is going to get us a long ways in understanding that relationship, because as you know, Tony and Larissa, that the two languages are so close. Although with respect to the subjunctive, they're very different. You guys don't follow all the rules. Subjunctive is,
yeah.
The subjunctive in Brazilian Portuguese is like a speed limit. You know, it's sort of a suggestion. I'm just kidding. But to be fair, they had a really hard time with the personal infinitive and the future subjunctive, which is very popular, which is just everyday sort of Portuguese, you know. So they struggled with it, Tony. They really did. But I can't say, because I say that my learners are a very different group. They're these heritage learners, right? I'm not getting people like LAEL or Bibiana, you know, and who are, you know, well, you know, developed in their ability to Spanish. You know, they probably struggle with their Spanish too, the ones that are teaching Portuguese. So.